The global economic landscape in early 2025 was rocked by a significant escalation in international trade tensions, primarily initiated by the United States under President Trump's administration. What began as a series of threats materialized into concrete actions, setting off a chain reaction that impacted global markets and international alliances.
In early April 2025, President Trump's administration implemented a sweeping tariff hike on Chinese goods, reaching a staggering 145% in quantities. This move, justified on the grounds of national interest, was framed as a retaliation against what the U.S. perceived as unfair trade practices. However, this aggressive measure was not taken in isolation. China, no longer willing to be seen as a subordinate in global trade, swiftly responded with its own 125% tariff on all U.S. imports. This rapid and significant retaliation signaled a clear shift in the dynamics between the two economic giants, moving beyond mere economic competition into a geopolitical showdown. The immediate repercussions of these tariffs were felt across various sectors. Wall Street experienced significant losses, with billions in market value evaporating. Oil prices saw a downturn, and Asian markets suffered their most significant blow since 2008. Within the United States, American consumers began to feel the pinch as prices on a wide range of goods, from clothing and electronics to agricultural products, started to climb due to the increased tariffs. This surge in prices pushed inflationary pressures to levels that were increasingly uncomfortable for the U.S. economy. Adding another layer of complexity, China took a drastic step by freezing all investments into the United States with immediate effect. This sudden directive from China's State Administration of Foreign Exchange cited escalating political risks and the urgent need to safeguard national assets as the official reasons. This action sent shockwaves through Wall Street, particularly impacting American companies, from high-tech firms to commercial real estate players, who had become reliant on Chinese capital for their expansion. The numbers revealed the magnitude of this shift. Chinese investments into the U.S. had already plunged by a staggering 95%, from a peak of $46 billion to a mere $2.3 billion in 2025, the lowest level in nearly 2 decades. Beyond the broad tariff war, a specific and intense battle was unfolding in the semiconductor industry. For a long time, the U.S. had been the dominant force in this sector, home to giants like Intel, AMD, and Texas Instruments. However, China, recognizing the immense value of the semiconductor market, began its ascent. The U.S., viewing China as a latecomer with little initial contribution to the industry, reacted with measures intended to curb China's progress. Sanctions were imposed, restricting exports to over 140 Chinese companies, including chip-making, equipment manufacturers. Contrary to the U.S.'s apparent intentions, these sanctions did not crush China's ambitions. Instead, they seemed to act as a catalyst for accelerated development. China responded by injecting a massive $410 billion into semiconductor research and development. This strategic investment fueled the growth of a self-sustaining semiconductor ecosystem within China. Consequently, China drastically reduced its imports of semiconductors from the U.S. and other Western countries by almost 50% in 2024. The results were startling. China's global semiconductor market share doubled from 15% to 30%. More significantly, Chinese companies began to surpass established leaders like Intel and TSMC in certain areas of chip technology, even producing 7-nanometer chips. In NAND flash memory technology, YMTC, a Chinese company, achieved a breakthrough by producing 232-layer NAND flash memory, a technology that the U.S. was struggling to keep pace with. This rapid advancement positioned China not just as a self-sufficient chip producer, but also as a leader in storage technology, leaving the U.S. and Western companies like ASML and Applied Materials in a precarious position, caught between sanctions and the lucrative Chinese market. The once undisputed dominance of the U.S. in the semiconductor industry was clearly being challenged, with China emerging as a formidable competitor. The ripple effects of U.S. trade policies extended beyond China, significantly impacting long-standing alliances, particularly with Canada. Historically, Canada had been heavily reliant on the U.S. as its primary energy export market, with over 95% of its oil exports heading south. However, the unpredictability of U.S. trade policies, exemplified by proposed tariffs on Canadian oil and gas imports, triggered a reassessment of Canada's strategic direction. Canada began to actively seek new, international partners, particularly in Asia and Europe. The completion of the Trans Mountain Expansion (TMX) project in early 2024 proved to be a game-changer. This infrastructure project tripled the capacity of the pipeline and, crucially, allowed Canadian crude oil to reach Pacific ports directly, bypassing U.S. territory for the first time. This newfound access opened doors to markets in China, Japan, and South Korea, which have refineries designed for the heavy sour crude that Canada produces. Seizing this opportunity, a major Chinese oil refining company, Rang Prochemical, established a presence in Calgary and quickly signed crude oil supply agreements with Canadian energy giants like Suncor. These agreements, utilizing flexible FOB terms, allowed for destination changes during shipment, providing Canada with greater control over its exports. Beyond crude oil, Canada also focused on liquefied natural gas, LNG, exports to Asia, through the LNG Canada project in British Columbia, backed by Shell, ProChina, and Mitsubishi, with exports expected to begin by the end of 2025. This diversification aimed to reduce Canada's over-reliance on the U.S. market and stabilize its energy revenue. Public sentiment in Canada increasingly supported this pivot, with surveys indicating a preference for building infrastructure aimed at non-U.S. markets. The long-standing energy relationship between Canada and the United States, built over decades, was facing a fundamental shift as Canada charted an independent path in the global energy game. Similar to Canada, the European Union also found itself increasingly questioning its reliance on the U.S. as a stable trade partner in the face of President Trump's aggressive tariff policies. The imposition of tariffs on European goods like steel, aluminum, and even champagne, sometimes reaching up to 200%, strained transatlantic relations and raised concerns about the benefits of the trade relationship for European nations. President Xi of China astutely seized this moment of uncertainty, extending a diplomatic invitation to the EU to unite against America's economic bullying, emphasizing that there are no winners in a tariff war. This message resonated in Brussels, where the heavy-handed U.S. trade strategy had begun to undermine trust. Traditional allies like the EU started to eye their options, with internal documents suggesting a potential realignment strategy to reduce reliance on U.S. trade in favor of, notably, China. European automakers, for instance, saw expansion in China as a strategic hedge against U.S. instability and began adjusting their operations to mitigate future tariff risks. Amidst these shifting global alliances, the European Union and Canada intensified their own trade relations. Driven by the escalating tensions with the U.S., both entities sought more stable and cooperative economic partnerships. Meetings between Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau and European Commission President von der Leyen and European Council President Costa in February 2025 underscored the commitment to deepening cooperation to promote global economic security and stability. Trade between the EU and Canada had already seen significant growth since the provisional application of the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, in 2017, with bilateral trade in goods and services increasing by 65% between 2016 and 2022. The U.S. tariffs on Canadian imports, though excluding energy, further incentivized Canada to strengthen its ties with the EU as an alternative market. Discussions even extended to enhancing defense cooperation, with Canada considering European-made military equipment to reduce dependence on U.S. suppliers. This growing synergy between the EU and Canada highlighted a broader trend of traditional U.S. allies seeking alternative partnerships in a world reshaped by volatile U.S. trade policies. The aggressive trade policies of the U.S., coupled with increasing geopolitical tensions, inadvertently fueled a growing trend of de-dollarization. For decades, the U.S. dollar had been the bedrock of the international monetary system, dominating global foreign exchange transactions and serving as the primary component of foreign reserves. However, the weaponization of the dollar through sanctions and the unpredictability of U.S. economic policies prompted nations to seek alternatives to reduce their reliance on the greenback. BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, emerged as key drivers in this realignment. These countries actively explored and implemented mechanisms to conduct trade in their local currencies, particularly in strategic sectors like energy. Russia and China, for example, had already settled over 90% of their bilateral trade in rubles and yuan. India began purchasing Russian oil using rupees, and new BRICS members like Iran and the UAE experimented with local currency settlements. The expansion of the BRICS economic bloc to include Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Iran, and the UAE further solidified its position as a significant challenger to the existing dollar-centric financial system. China, in particular, actively promoted the use of its currency, the yuan or renminbi, in international trade, especially in energy transactions. Simultaneously, China strategically reduced its holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds over 17 months, signaling a long-term strategy to lessen its dependence on the U.S. dollar. This was coupled with a significant increase in China's gold reserves, viewed as an independent financial asset resistant to freezing or devaluation. Even traditional U.S. allies began to explore alternatives. The weakening trust in the dollar, exacerbated by the unpredictable U.S. policies, spurred several countries to enter currency swap agreements and regional payment systems, further bypassing the dollar in cross-border transactions. International financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank noted a gradual but significant reallocation in global reserves, with the dollar's share declining while holdings in gold and other currencies increased. This shift indicated a growing global desire for a more diversified and potentially more stable international financial system, less reliant on the policies of a single nation. The aggressive trade policies enacted by the Trump administration had significant and negative consequences for the U.S. economy itself. The tariffs led to higher import costs, which were largely passed on to American consumers, resulting in rising prices for a wide range of goods. Analysts at Yale University estimated that the average U.S. household would incur an additional $3,800 to $4,200 in annual costs due to the tariffs. This surge in consumer prices contributed to a rise in inflation, putting significant pressure on both citizens and businesses. Furthermore, the retaliatory tariffs imposed by other countries, like China and Canada, dampened demand for U.S. exports, particularly in sectors such as agriculture and manufacturing. For instance, China's cancellation of soybean contracts from the U.S. resulted in a $22 billion loss and impacted farmers significantly. The trade disputes also disrupted supply chains and created uncertainty for businesses relying on imported materials and components. The financial markets reacted negatively to the trade turmoil. The S&P 500 plummeted, and Wall Street investors experienced considerable panic. The U.S. dollar index, DXY, saw a significant decline, reflecting a broader erosion of confidence in U.S. economic stability. Concerns about a potential recession grew, with economists revising GDP growth forecasts downwards. Domestically, these economic pressures fueled political discontent. In Michigan, a focus group of voters who had previously supported Trump expressed feelings of betrayal, citing rising prices, job losses, and a worsening quality of life as direct consequences of the administration's policies. The perceived, erratic nature of the policies and the involvement of figures like Elon Musk, who was not elected, further alienated some voters. Even in traditionally conservative states like Wisconsin, a Supreme Court race saw a Democratic-backed candidate win, signaling a potential shift in the political landscape and reflecting dissatisfaction with the prevailing political climate. The immense amount of money poured into this state-level election highlighted the high stakes and the deep divisions within the U.S. political system. Canada's response to the U.S. trade aggression demonstrated a significant shift in its posture towards its southern neighbor. The imposition of U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum in 2018, which cost Canada's economy billions, spurred retaliatory measures from Ottawa, including tariffs on U.S. goods. The trade tensions in early 2025 further solidified Canada's resolve to diversify its economic and strategic partnerships. Beyond seeking new trade partners in Asia and Europe, Canada also began to reduce its military dependence on the U.S. The significant defense deal with Australia to purchase long-range radar systems for Arctic surveillance signaled a move towards greater self-reliance in national security. Canada also explored alternatives to U.S. defense contracts, even considering dropping a F-35 fighter jet deal in favor of Sweden's Gripen. Public opinion in Canada played a crucial role in this shift. The perception of the U.S. as an unpredictable and unreliable partner led to a growing sentiment in favor of reducing dependence. Data revealed a decline in Canadians crossing the U.S. border for tourism and a decrease in spending on American goods, with a corresponding increase in demand for Canadian-made products. Protests against the trade conflict even erupted in border cities like Detroit and Windsor, highlighting the deep connections and shared interests between the two nations that were being strained by the trade disputes. The willingness of Canada to stand firm against U.S. trade pressures and actively seek alternative paths underscored a significant transformation in the dynamics of the U.S.-Canada relationship. The unfolding events in early 2025 painted a picture of a global landscape undergoing significant and rapid change, driven by shifting trade policies, evolving alliances, and a growing push towards a more multipolar economic and political order. The long-term consequences of these shifts remained uncertain, but the immediate impacts were undeniable, affecting economies, consumers, and international relations worldwide.
Highlights a potential reshaping of the global financial order driven by U.S. trade policies and China's response. China is leveraging its digital yuan, ECNY, as a significant financial tool, aiming to move away from US, the traditional dollar-centric system. The ECNY is described as a state-issued, monitored, and potentially reversible cross-border payment ecosystem. Its pilot phase reportedly processed over 1.8 trillion yuan, approximately $250 billion USD.
China has also seen a significant increase in the use of its homegrown payment network, CIPS, which now handles 38% of China's global trade, bypassing SWIFT. Examples include oil purchases in Kenya using yuan and Argentina partially repaying
an IMF loan in yuan due to a lack of dollars. The yuan's share of global transactions has also seen a substantial increase. Pilot tests of ECNY between Hong Kong and the UAE showed significantly reduced costs and settlement times. ECNY is being integrated into various initiatives, including linking with local payment systems in Malaysia and adoption by small businesses in Indonesia via QRCNY wallets. 13 countries involved in the Belt and Road Initiative are reportedly using ECNY for infrastructure projects. The video emphasizes China's response to U.S. tariffs. Instead of direct counter-tariffs, China has accelerated the integration of ECNY in its export trade, with digital yuan usage rising by 19.3%. Letters of credit in yuan are also becoming cheaper than dollar-based equivalents. This is portrayed as a software upgrade race rather than a traditional trade war. The impact of U.S. trade policies on the stock market and public trust is also discussed. While the U.S. stock market saw a significant surge following the announcement of a tariff suspension, this did not necessarily translate to improved financial well-being for ordinary Americans, who have experienced losses in savings and face continued financial risks. The inconsistency of U.S. trade policies, such as imposing tariffs and then suspending them for allies, has created an unpredictable investment environment, leading to capital flight from sensitive areas and increased anxiety among investors. Alliances and international relations are also significantly affected. Many of America's longtime allies, including the EU, Japan, and Canada, are expressing serious doubts about the sustainability of their relationships with the U.S. due to these inconsistent policies and tariff adjustments based on personal emotions, without international coordination. Consequently, allied countries are reportedly moving away from U.S. bonds and the U.S. dollar, seeking safer assets and exploring new cooperation scenarios independent of the U.S. This shift is attributed to concerns about the return of the America First policy, higher tariffs, and financial sanctions. In the last 3 months of 2024, a range of nations, including Brazil, Ireland, the Cayman Islands, Canada, India, Norway, and even Japan and China, carried out a massive sell-off of U.S. bonds. The video also highlights a divergence in actions regarding Ukraine. While Canada has announced a significant aid package for Ukraine funded by seized Russian assets, the U.S. has drastically reduced its aid. This has led allies to question America's reliability, with Europe potentially taking a leading role in NATO and developing its own defense capabilities. French President Emmanuel Macron emphasized that Europe cannot wait for America and needs to act now. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg also noted the uncertainty of relying on the US indefinitely. Concerns surrounding Donald Trump's rhetoric and policies are a recurring theme. His trade war policies, criticisms of NATO and allies like Ireland, and controversial social remarks are causing concern among economists and political figures. Economists warn that these policies could lead to a severe recession in the US. The silence from the Republican Party in the face of these policies is also highlighted as a troubling sign. Analysts predict that if the current situation continues, the US economy could face a deep recession, rising unemployment, and business bankruptcies. The video concludes